The Wrenfield Library at midnight held a particular quality of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something held back. One lamp burned on the great desk, casting a circle of amber light that did not reach the shelves, and in that circle sat Sebastian Ashcombe, Marquess of Wrenfield, in his shirt sleeves, his hair undone for the first time in 9 years of careful performance. In his hands, a small leather diary, its pages soft with handling, open to a passage marked with a black ribbon. He had been reading for 3 hours. He had read it twice through. His coat lay over the back of the chair. The fire had gone to coals. He had not moved to rebuild it. Somewhere above him, in the room she had occupied for 4 months as his late aunt's companion, Miss Helena Pembridge had heard the library lamp burning and had not come down. Not until now. The door opened without a knock. She stood in her dressing gown, her dark hair loose at her shoulders, her hands at her sides with a steadiness that had cost her something to maintain. She looked at him across the length of the room. He looked up from the diary. He did not rise. "I have been reading your diary," he said. Helena did not move from the doorway. Her voice came at the same register as his. "I know. I wrote it for you to find." The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere and settled again. Neither looked away. What followed was 40 minutes that neither of them would entirely be able to account for afterward. Not because anything was unclear, but because clarity, at that pitch, has a way of compressing time. They did not raise their voices. They did not concede ground. Sebastian set the diary on the desk, but kept one hand near it, as though it might be withdrawn. "Why me?" he said. It was not quite a question. Helena came 3 steps into the room and stopped. "Because you visit the right cousins twice a year, and you notice the wrong things at dinner. Because you read the parliamentary reports on property law, and you have done something about them, which is more than most men with the relevant power have managed. I needed someone with access to Marbury's household and the intelligence to understand what he had done. You were the only candidate who met both requirements." "A flattering portrait," Sebastian said, "of a man being selected as a useful instrument." "I did not say you were a useful instrument. I said you were the only candidate." She held his gaze. "There is a difference." "And the diary?" "The diary was calibrated to make a man with any conscience investigate his cousin," Helena said. "Enough hints to point toward Marbury's conduct 3 years ago. Enough of my own thinking to hold the attention of a man who reads properly." Sebastian's finger moved to a page near the middle. "This entry. The one about the salt cellar at the second dinner. The one about the way Marbury laughs a half-second before the person beside him has finished speaking, because he has already decided what the joke is." He paused. "That is not evidence. That is observation for its own sake." She said simply, "Yes." "And this one?" He turned several pages. "The one about the quality of the light in the East Corridor at 4 in the afternoon in November. That is not Marbury at all." "No," she said, "it is not." "So the diary is 2 things," Sebastian said. "An instrument aimed at me, and something else." She met his eyes. "Yes." He looked at her directly. "What do you want, specifically?" Helena crossed to the chair opposite the desk and sat without being invited. "There is a document in the bottom drawer of the writing desk in Marbury's Hertfordshire house. A letter he wrote to Sophia, my sister, under a false name, containing a promise of marriage he had no legal standing to make and no intention of honoring. He kept it. I do not know why men keep such things. Vanity, perhaps. That letter, combined with the financial records I have already compiled, is sufficient to ruin him through the courts. The drawer is locked. The key is on his person. A family member visiting the house on ordinary social business could access that desk without question. You cannot. Sebastian was quiet for a moment. And the access was the purpose of the companion position. It was one purpose. And the diary was to secure my cooperation. It was one purpose, she said again. He leaned back in the chair and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in 4 months of careful watching. Not cold, not amused, not the cultivated distance he wore in company. Something else, something that had not had much exercise. Were you performing, he said carefully, affection, to secure that access? The room was very quiet. The coals shifted. Helena's hands, folded in her lap, did not move. I stopped performing affection, she said, around the 3rd week. Sebastian said nothing. The diary entries you have been reading, Helena continued, and her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they are being held by effort, are the only honest things I have written in 3 years. I want that understood. The plan is real. The purpose is real. And those entries are also real. I am not asking you to resolve that contradiction tonight because I have not resolved it myself. Sebastian picked up the diary again. He turned to a page near the back and read it in silence for a moment. Then he set it down and asked, very quietly, a question she had not prepared for. Is your sister still alive? Helena's composure, 3 years of it, built in a room in Northumberland while Sophia wept, and then stopped weeping, and then went silent. Built across 6 months of a household she was not born to serve. Built through every dinner with Marbury's laugh filling the room. Broke. Not with tears. With something underneath tears, the raw, exhausted relief of being asked a real question by someone who intended to hear the answer. She answered quietly, yes. She is. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice did not sound quite like his own. Then tomorrow we begin again, he said. Tonight you should sleep. The 4 months that had built to this night did not arrange themselves in order when Helena moved through them later. They came in fragments, the way significant things do when you have been too busy surviving them to examine them as they happened. She had arrived at Wrenfield Park in July as companion to Lady Ashcombe, the Marquess's elderly aunt. A position secured through a chain of quiet social connections Helena had spent 6 months constructing. Lady Ashcombe was sharp, fond of backgammon, and entirely indifferent to the question of whether her companion was actually an earl's younger sister in temporary disguise. Helena had been grateful for the indifference. She filed the household. She learned the rhythms of the place, which servants talked, which did not, which rooms Marbury used when he visited, where the letters were kept, how long Sebastian typically spent in the library after dinner. She was thorough. She was always thorough. Marbury had come twice. The first time was in August, 3 weeks after Helena's arrival. She had known he would come. Wrenfield's guest books showed 2 visits every year, regular as the seasons. And she had prepared herself. She had been preparing herself for 3 years. She stood at the drawing-room window the afternoon his carriage arrived, and she told herself she was ready. She was not ready for the laugh. It was the same laugh Sophia had described. Easy, warm. The laugh of a man entirely comfortable in any room he entered because he had never once stood in a room that had the power to diminish him. He laughed at dinner, and the servants smiled. He laughed at Sebastian's dry observation about the harvest reports, and Sebastian's mouth curved slightly in response. Helena's hand on the wineglass stem went white at the knuckles. She held it. She held everything. She watched him across the table and she thought, I have your letter. I am coming for your letter." She did not look at Sebastian. It was at that dinner, Marbury's second visit in October, 2 weeks before the night in the library, that the first thing Helena had not planned for occurred. The table was laid for 8. Marbury sat at Sebastian's right. Helena sat 4 places down, in the position appropriate to a companion, between the vicar's wife and a visiting cousin, whose name she had already forgotten. The conversation moved around her. She was watching Marbury's hands. He had a habit of touching his coat pocket when he mentioned Hertfordshire. She had noted it at the first dinner and was confirming it now. Sebastian reached across the table for the salt cellar. He did not look at her directly. His fingers, passing the dish, brushed hers where her hand rested near her wine glass. The lightest contact, a half-second, steadying in a way she could not account for. Neither looked at the other. The conversation continued. Helena catalogued the contact and set it in the column of useful intelligence, and did not let herself examine it further. She examined it later, alone in her room, for longer than she intended. The diary had begun the week after Marbury's first visit. She opened it on a Tuesday evening with the blank pages in front of her, and she wrote the first entry with complete deliberateness, knowing what she was doing, knowing why. She chose her words the way she chose everything, for their effect on the specific reader she had in mind. She knew Sebastian read alone in the library after midnight. She knew he had a habit of picking up whatever was left on the side table near the east window. She would leave the diary there, once, open to an innocuous page, and then replace it on the shelf in her room. And he would wonder about it. She had planned it carefully. What she had not planned for was that the entries, once she began writing them, would insist on being true. She wrote about Marbury's laugh and the white knuckle on the glass stem. She had intended that entry to be bait, a hint toward the real purpose, and it was also exactly what she had felt. She wrote about the East Corridor light in November, and she had not intended that entry for any purpose at all. She wrote about the brush of fingers at the dinner table, and she described it as useful intelligence, and then sat for a long time looking at what she had written before she closed the diary and put it away. She knew what she was doing. She knew why. She did not yet know, that October evening, that she would mean every word. The morning after the library conversation arrived gray and cold, with frost on the gateposts and the first real bite of winter in the air. Helena's trunk stood by the gate at 7:30. She had packed the night before, after Sebastian told her to sleep. She had gone upstairs and packed, because the plan had always required her to leave once she had secured his involvement. And she was not a woman who abandoned plans simply because they had become complicated. She would not stay in a house where she was watched by everyone and owed nothing. She had made that calculation 4 months ago, and she saw no reason to revise it at 7 in the morning. She stood by the trunk in her traveling coat and waited for the carriage. Sebastian came out of the house without a coat. He did not attempt to stop her. He did not say her name or stand in her path or make any of the gestures she had half-prepared responses for during the 20 minutes she had stood waiting. He walked across the frost-rimed gravel and stopped a yard from her and held out a folded paper. "What is this?" Helena asked. "A banker's draft," he said. "The wages owed my aunt's companion for 4 months of service. Calculated correctly, which they were not previously. Lady Ashcombe's steward underpaid by 1/3. I have corrected the error." Helena looked at the paper and did not take it immediately. "You are paying me." "My aunt is paying you. I am correcting a clerical failure." He held the draft steady. "Take it. It has no conditions attached, and it is not from me." She took it. She folded it into her coat pocket without looking at the sum. Sebastian removed his own coat, the heavy wool traveling coat he had evidently put on for the express purpose of coming outside. And she understood in the same moment that he had dressed for the cold knowing she would refuse if he offered it directly. He set it across her trunk, smoothed it once, and stepped back. "It will be cold past York," he said. "I am aware of the geography," Helena replied. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you are aware of most things." He looked at her for a moment with that same expression from the library, the one that had not had much exercise. And then he went back inside before the carriage arrived. He did not touch her. He did not watch her leave. The door closed. The frost on the gateposts did not melt. Helena stood by her trunk with her hands in her pockets and waited for the sound of wheels on the road. Within the week following her departure, 2 things happened without her knowledge or permission. The first, Sebastian contacted his solicitor, a man named Hartwell, known for his discretion and his particular expertise in financial fraud, and instructed him to begin a formal investigation of Sir Reginald Marbury's accounts. He did not explain his reasons to Hartwell. He did not need to. Hartwell was paid to be thorough and to ask the right questions of the right clerks, and he was very good at his work. The second, Sebastian wrote a letter to Helena's brother, Edmund, the Earl of Pembridge, a man he had never met, whose address he obtained through 3 careful inquiries. The letter was brief. It stated his name, his understanding of the general situation, and his intention to be useful in whatever capacity her brother thought appropriate. It stated plainly that he expected no reply and would not be offended by the absence of one. He sealed it and sent it before he could examine his reasons too closely. He did not tell Helena either of these things. He had no means to tell her. She had not left a London address. Helena's rented room in Bloomsbury was small and north-facing and suited her purposes exactly. She had a writing desk, a good lamp, access to the reading room at the British Museum 3 streets away, and a landlady who asked no questions. She worked from 7 in the morning until she was too tired to read accurately. And then she worked a little longer. She had 3 years of accumulated research to organize into a form that solicitors could use. She had Marbury's financial history going back 8 years. She had the names of 4 other women, none of whom would speak publicly, all of whom had confirmed the pattern in private correspondence she had gathered with considerable patience. She had everything except the letter in the Hertfordshire desk drawer. The plan was proceeding. She told herself this every morning. It was in the 3rd week that she began to notice the discrepancies. A clerk at the Chancery offices mentioned, in passing, that the Marbury accounts had been formally flagged for review by a private solicitor. A contact at the Financial Records Office confirmed that someone with considerable access and considerable resources had been moving through Marbury's paper trail at a speed Helena could not account for. Her own work was careful and thorough. This was something else. This was faster. This was better resourced than anything she had arranged. She sat with this information for 2 days. She was furious in a way that had no clean outlet, because the work being done was work she needed done. And her fury at not having been consulted was tangled up with something else she was not prepared to name. Marbury, meanwhile, was not idle. He had the instincts of a man who had spent his adult life reading the social weather, and he felt the pressure building around him the way certain animals feel a change in the air before a storm. He sent a letter to Edmund, a letter calculated to threaten without being specific enough to be actionable, the kind of letter that said nothing and meant everything. Then, under the stated pretense of concern for Helena's professional reputation following Lady Ashcombe's death, he attempted to call on her publicly. She was in a tea room near Covent Garden when he found her, a place she had chosen specifically because it was public and because she knew the proprietress. Marbury entered in his good coat with his easy walk and his warm smile, and he sat down across from her without being invited. And the room noticed, because the room always noticed Marbury. "Miss Pembridge," he said. "What a fortunate coincidence." "Sir Reginald," Helena replied, and poured her tea with a steady hand. "I had heard you were in London," he said. "I wanted to assure myself of your well-being. Lady Ashcombe's passing must have left you in an uncertain position." "My position is quite certain," Helena said. "I find I prefer it." Marbury smiled. It was the same smile she had watched across Sebastian's dinner table. "I wonder," he said, his voice dropping just enough to be private without being invisible, "whether you have given sufficient thought to how your recent activities might appear to those who observe them. A companion of uncertain background, taking an extended interest in the private affairs of a family she served. It has a particular quality, does it not?" Helena set down her cup. She looked at him with the same expression she had used at every dinner, attentive, pleasant, entirely unrevealing. "I find," she said, "that I have given very precise thought to how my activities appear. I am not, however, especially concerned with your assessment of them." "You should be," he said quietly. "I am a man with a great many connections and a long memory." "So am I," Helena replied. "A man with a long memory, I mean, or the equivalent. I find the categories are less fixed than they once were." She picked up her cup again. "I think you have made your calculation of my situation, Sir Reginald. And I think you have calculated incorrectly. I would encourage you to review your arithmetic before we speak again." He left. The room had seen the encounter. The room always saw everything. By the following morning, the whispers had begun. A companion who had been at Wrenfield, a cousin of the Marquess, a public confrontation that meant something, though no one could say precisely what. That evening, in her north-facing room, Helena sat for a long time at her writing desk without opening anything. Then she took out a plain notebook, not the diary, something new, and wrote one sentence at the top of the first page. She did not address it to anyone. She did not know yet who it was for. 3 weeks after she had left Wrenfield, a letter arrived from neutral counsel at the Inns of Court requesting her presence to sign documents connected to the Marbury financial investigation. The letter was formal and correct and gave nothing away. Helena put on her good coat and went. The anteroom was small and smelled of old paper and beeswax. There was a table covered in deeds and documents. There was a solicitor named Hartwell standing near the window who had the look of a man who had recently been given instructions he found professionally interesting. And there was Sebastian, already seated at the table in his town coat, looking at a document with the focused attention he brought to everything he did not want to look up from. He looked up. "You arranged this," Helena said. "I arranged the legal work," Sebastian replied. "The summons was Hartwell's. He needed your signature on 3 documents and mine on 2. The overlap was unavoidable." "Nothing about this was unavoidable," Helena said, and sat down across from him because there was nowhere else to sit and because she would not give him the satisfaction of remaining standing. "You have been working Marbury's accounts for 3 weeks without my knowledge or my permission. You have resources I cannot match, and you have been using them on a matter that is mine." "The matter," Sebastian said carefully, "involves my cousin and my household and my late aunt's companion, who was not, in fact, my late aunt's companion. I considered I had some standing. You had no standing to act without asking me first." Hartwell found a reason to examine the window very closely. You had not left an address, Sebastian said. Then you should have waited until you had one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Tell me what remains, and I will follow your direction for the rest of it. Whether you follow my direction is not the point. The point is that you acted without asking. I know, he said. I know that. He reached across the table to indicate a specific clause in the document nearest her, his finger moving to the line, and her hand was already there, her index finger on the same passage. He stopped. His fingers settled over hers on the paper, and neither of them moved. The room held its breath. I should not have acted without your permission, Sebastian said. His voice was very quiet. I could not bear to do nothing. I understand that is not a justification. Helena looked at their hands on the document for a long moment. Then she withdrew hers slowly, picked up the pen, and signed. That night, in her north-facing room, she took out the plain notebook and wrote him a letter. She wrote for an hour. She described what it had cost her to leave Wrenfield at dawn, what it had cost her to read the diary entries back on the coach past York, knowing she had meant them. She described the specific quality of his silence in the library when she had said the third week, how that silence had been more careful with her than most people's words. She wrote things she had not said to anyone in 3 years. She did not send it. She folded it and put it inside the notebook cover and set the notebook in the bottom of her trunk. In his London study that same night, Sebastian opened a letter that had been waiting for him for 10 days. Helena Pembridge's reply to the letter Sebastian had sent without expecting an answer. He read it slowly. Then he sat for a long time without moving. The letter open on the desk in front of him, the lamp burning down around him, while he thought about what it meant to be the kind of man who deserved to receive it. Marbury moved first. He published a letter, not in the newspapers, which would have been actionable, but in his clubs, which was worse, because club letters circulated without attribution and arrived at every breakfast table in Mayfair within 48 hours. The letter described, with great regret and apparent sorrow, a woman of calculated ambition who had entered a noble household under false pretenses, who had used the trust of a dying elderly woman to position herself near the household's master, and whose motives were, in his considered view, those of a woman with no reputation left to protect. It was half true. The half that was true was the half that would be believed. Doors closed. Not all of them. Helena had not had many doors to begin with, having spent 3 years avoiding society. But the ones that had remained cracked shut now with a finality she could hear from across London. Her brother Edmund sent a note through his solicitor. A formal statement, carefully worded, that protected the Pembridge name by declining to confirm or deny any connection to Miss Helena Pembridge's recent activities. She understood it. She did not blame him. He had Sophia to protect, and his own household, and 3 years of silence to maintain. She sat in her north-facing room on a Tuesday morning with Marbury's letter in her hand, and read it aloud to herself from beginning to end. She did this deliberately, to hear what it sounded like when spoken, to register its full weight without flinching from it. She could answer it. She had the resources to answer it. She had the financial records. She had 4 women's private confirmations. She had 3 years of documented evidence. She could write a response that would make Marbury's letter look like what it was. The panic of a man who could see the walls closing. She did not write the response. Defending herself meant explaining the reason for her investigation. Explaining the reason meant naming Sophia. And Sophia had spent 3 years choosing silence. Not because she was ashamed, Helena believed, but because the silence was the only territory she owned, the only decision that had been entirely hers since the night Marbury had taken everything else. Sophia had the right to her own silence. Helena would not spend it on her own behalf. She set the letter down. She did not weep. She made tea and sat with it until it was cold. The letter from Northumberland arrived 4 days later. It was from the woman who looked after the cottage, a brief note, plain and direct. Miss Sophia had taken a fever. Not dangerous, the note said, but she had been asking for her sister. Helena was packed and at the night mail coach within 3 hours. She arrived at the Northumberland cottage the following evening to find Sophia propped against pillows by the fire, pale and thin and more herself than Helena had seen her in 3 years. Fever had stripped away whatever performance Sophia had been maintaining for Helena's visits, and what remained was simply her sister, 23 years old, tired, and glad to see her. Helena sat beside the bed and took her hand, and did not say anything for a long time, and Sophia did not ask her to. Sebastian arrived the following evening. He had learned from Edmund. The letter between them had apparently opened a channel that functioned faster than Helena had anticipated. He came on horseback rather than by carriage, and arrived at the cottage door at 7 in the evening, with mud on his boots and no luggage, and the look of a man who had ridden hard and not stopped to think about whether he was welcome. Helena opened the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. "How is she?" he asked. "Better. The fever broke this morning." He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said, and waited. After a long moment, Helena stepped back from the door and gestured him in. He did not take the offered chair. He sat on the floor by the hearth, his back against the stone, and Sophia looked at him from her pillows with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of someone too recently ill to maintain social conventions. "You are Sebastian Ashcombe," Sophia said. "I am," he said. "Helena has not told me much about you," Sophia said. "That means she has been thinking about you constantly." "Sophia," Helena said. Sophia replied serenely, "I am ill. I am allowed to say true things." The three of them remained that way for hours. Sophia drifting in and out of sleep. Helena reading aloud at intervals from a book she had found on the cottage shelf. Sebastian sitting on the floor by the fire with his knees drawn up, occasionally feeding the coals when they dropped. It was, Helena thought, the strangest evening she could remember. It was also, in some way she could not yet examine, the most peaceful. Late, when Sophia had been deeply asleep for an hour and the fire had settled to a steady glow, Helena's hand found Sebastian's on the rug between them. She had not planned it. Her hand simply moved. His turned over slowly, and her fingers settled into his, and they sat without speaking while the fire burned low, and the Northumberland night pressed at the cottage windows, and Sophia slept, breathing steadily, safe. They sat until dawn. Neither slept. They did not need to speak. The kitchen garden behind the cottage was small and winter bare. The beds turned over and waiting for spring. A low stone wall at the far end with a view across the fell. Helena walked there the next morning while Sebastian was inside with Sophia, and he came out to find her standing at the wall with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the distance. He came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd her, close enough to be present. "I do not know what I am to you," Helena said. She said it without turning her head, because she had learned that some things were easier to say, to the middle distance. "I know what I intended you to be. I know that intention failed somewhere around the 3rd week, as I told you. But knowing a thing failed is not the same as knowing what replaced it." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been a man performing a life for 9 years. I built the performance after my father died, and I hardened it after Charlotte died, and I became very good at it. I know what I looked like from the outside. I know what you thought you were working with when you wrote the diary." He paused. "I am not angry about the diary. I want that clear." "I know," she said quietly. "What I want to tell you," he continued, and his voice had the quality it had taken on in the library, the one that did not quite sound like his own, the one that came from somewhere the performance had not reached, "is that you are the first person in 9 years who has made me want to stop. Not because you saw through me, though you did. Because you showed me something worth being seen by." He stopped. "I am not asking you for anything. I am not making a case. I am telling you where I am, because you have been honest with me, and I owe you the same." Helena stood at the wall for a long moment. She looked at the fell. She thought about 3 years of cold purpose and the woman she had become inside it, and whether that woman was someone she recognized, and whether recognition was the same as approval. Then she turned. She stepped forward. She kissed him, once, slowly, her decision entire and deliberate, not a response to anything he had done, but a beginning she was choosing on her own terms. His hand came up to her face, careful and unhurried, and then she stepped back. "I will let you know," she said, "when I am ready." He returned to London to finish the legal case. Helena stayed with Sophia. 10 days passed without a letter between them, not by accident, but by a kind of mutual understanding that some things needed space to settle. Marbury, his finances ruined through the legal work Sebastian and Hartwell had executed over 6 weeks, fled to the continent before the formal proceedings could conclude. The case closed without a trial. Helena's name remained, as she had known it would, permanently complicated. Some doors would not open to her again. She had known this when she began, 3 years ago, in a Northumberland cottage, watching her sister go silent. She did not regret it. She stayed with Sophia until the color came back to her face and the steadiness returned to her voice. Then she returned to London. She was in her north-facing room on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after she had left Wrenfield at dawn, when the package arrived. It was wrapped in plain brown paper. Her name was on it in Sebastian's handwriting. Inside, her diary, the leather soft and familiar in her hands. She set it on the desk and opened it to the first page, expecting to find it simply returned. It was not simply returned. After her final entry, the last page she had written in her own hand, came 70 new pages in his handwriting. She recognized the quality of the ink, the particular pressure of his pen, the way he formed certain letters. The entries began the morning after she had walked out of Wrenfield's gate. They were dated daily. He had used the same forms she used, observations, small things, the texture of days. He wrote about the library at 7 in the morning with the lamp still burning because he had not come up. He wrote about the coat he had put on her trunk and the fact that he had not, as he had told himself he would, watched her carriage leave. He wrote about the moment he had read her entry about the East Corridor light and understood, for the first time in 9 years, that someone had been paying attention to the same things he paid attention to and had thought it worth writing down. He wrote about Charlotte, briefly, carefully, without self-pity. He wrote that he had spent 9 years believing his capacity for feeling things had been buried with her, and that the burial had been a mercy, and that Helena's diary had made him understand that he had been wrong on both counts. He wrote about the Inns of Court and her hand under his on the document, and the fact that he had not been able to make himself move for the same reason he had not been able to do nothing for 6 weeks, because doing nothing, in this particular case, felt like the worst available choice. He wrote about her sister. He wrote about the morning in the kitchen garden and what she had looked like standing at the stone wall with her hands in her pockets, talking to the distance. He wrote that he had understood, in that moment, that she was not a woman who needed to be saved from anything. He wrote that this was not a qualification. It was the thing he admired most. Page after page, a man learning to write down what he actually thought, because the woman who had taught him it was possible was gone, and the only way to keep doing it was to keep doing it. Helena read every page. She read them through once, and then sat with the diary closed in her hands for the rest of the day. The next day she read them again. On the morning of the third day, she turned to the final entry, dated that morning. I have done what I could not tell you I was doing. Marbury is finished. Your sister is safe. None of this earns you. I am not asking you to come back. I am asking whether, when you are ready, I might call on you. As a man with no claim, no title between us, nothing to perform, and see if there is still something to say. Helena sat with that for a long time. Then she took her pen, turned the page over, and wrote on the back of it in her own hand, in the same deliberate way she had written the first diary entry 4 months ago. But this time without calculation, without instrument, without anything except the plain truth of what she wanted. Come Thursday. Bring nothing. She wrapped the diary, addressed it, and sent it back. He arrived at 7 on Thursday evening with nothing in his hands. She opened the door. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he did not say anything decorative. He said, "Good evening, Helena." "Come in," she said. "I have made tea, and then we will need more tea because I expect this will take some time." It took 3 hours for the first conversation, which covered, among other things, the full account of what Hartwell had done and how, the specific contents of the Hertfordshire letter which Sebastian had obtained through a method he described with a brevity that made Helena conclude she did not need the details. The question of Sophia's future, which Sebastian had already been thinking about in terms of a southern estate that Edmund had mentioned in correspondence as being available, and the matter of what Helena intended to do with the next portion of her life, now that the project of 3 years was concluded. "I intend," Helena said, pouring the second pot of tea, "to be a great deal more difficult than I have been for the past 3 years. I have been very focused. Focus is a narrowing. I find I would like to expand." "In what direction?" Sebastian asked. "Several," she said. "I have been corresponding with 2 women who work on the Property Law Reform Committee your parliamentary colleagues have been stalling for 4 years. I have opinions about the stalling. I also have 3 years of documented evidence about how the existing law functions in practice, which is to say, badly." She handed him his cup. "I imagine you have opinions about the stalling as well." "Considerable ones," he said. "Good," Helena said. "Then we have something to discuss." They discussed it for 3 more hours. Late, very late, the lamp burning low and the tea long since finished, Helena set down her empty cup and looked at him across the small table. "Would you like to stay?" she asked. Sebastian looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. The lamp burned low. The north-facing room held the quiet of a city very late at night. Nothing else needs to be said about that night, except what was written the next morning. The diary lay open on the bedside table, a fresh page in Helena's handwriting. He stayed. "Tomorrow we begin properly." The Wrenfield library in autumn light was different from the library at midnight. The shelves held more warmth, the windows more gold, and there were now 2 desks where there had been one. Helena had requested the second be moved in from the east room. and Sebastian had arranged it without comment, placed where she had indicated, facing the windows she preferred. Her books occupied 3 shelves she had chosen. His occupied the rest. The arrangement was not symmetrical. It suited them both. They were not yet married. They would be on terms Helena was in the process of naming, and Sebastian was in the process of honoring. And the naming and honoring were proceeding at a pace they had both agreed was correct. There was a great deal to name. She was thorough about it, as she was thorough about everything. Sophia had come south for the first time in 3 years. Sebastian had written the invitation to Sophia before he had asked Helena anything about their own future. A fact Helena had discovered in the diary and had not mentioned to him, but had thought about on several occasions, with a quality of feeling she was still learning to live with. Sophia was in the yellow room at the end of the east corridor, the one with the best light, and she had been at Wrenfield for 3 weeks and had, in that time, walked every path on the estate, read half the library's novels, and told Sebastian at dinner that his cook's method with the autumn pears was the finest she had encountered in 3 years of Northumberland cooking, which was faint praise, but delivered with enough warmth to make him smile. Sophia was not recovered exactly. Recovery was not quite the right word for what 3 years of chosen silence and 1 act of deliberate emergence looked like. But she was present. She was at dinner. She laughed occasionally at things that were genuinely funny. Helena watched her across the table some evenings and felt something she had no precise name for. Not relief, which she had felt in the library when Sebastian asked his question, and not the cold satisfaction of a completed design, which she had felt when Marbury's finances collapsed. Something quieter. Something that had to do with the fact that the worst had not in the end been permanent. The closing image of that autumn was this: Helena at her desk by the window, writing a letter to one of the property law reform women, a long letter full of specific argument and documented evidence and particular proposals for the parliamentary session in spring. Sebastian at his desk across the room, reading a brief from Hartwell about a related case that had come to his attention and that he intended to raise with his parliamentary colleagues at the earliest opportunity. Between them, on the table in the center of the room, the diary, closed. They had stopped needing it some weeks ago. It had served its purpose, which was, in the end, not the purpose Helena had designed it for. It had been an instrument aimed at a man she had intended to use. It had become, instead, the conversation that neither of them had known how to begin any other way. The instrument had taught them both to speak directly. Now they spoke directly. Sebastian looked up from his brief and said, "The Marbury precedent. If Hartwell moves on the related case, it will establish something useful in property law. I want your read on the documents before I take it to the committee." "Leave them on my desk," Helena said, without looking up from her own letter. "I will have notes by Friday." "Thursday," he said. She looked up. He looked at her with the expression that had not had much exercise for 9 years, and that had, over the course of this autumn, become simply his face, the one underneath the performance, the one that had been waiting. "Thursday," she said. "Bring the Hertfordshire precedent as well. I have thoughts." "You always have thoughts," he said. "Yes," Helena said. "I know. It is one of the things you like best about me." He did not deny it. He went back to his reading. Helena went back to her letter. Outside, the autumn light moved across the Wrenfield grounds, and in the east corridor Sophia was walking, and the diary lay closed between 2 desks in a library that had, 6 weeks ago, held 1 lamp and 1 man, reading something he had not been meant to understand. He had understood it anyway. That was the thing about Sebastian Ashcombe that Helena had not, in 3 years of careful planning, accounted for. She had planned for a man who would be useful. She had not planned for a man who would be real. She had stopped minding the miscalculation some time ago.